everyone for joining today's webinar. Our webinar today is called Equity Centered and Systems Thinking Leadership in the Classroom. And I have the pleasure of being your host today for today's session. My name is Lizbeth Villardo Cardenas. I also go by Liz, and I am a PFF Fellow. And I am joined today by my co-host, Noah Ringler, who is also a PFF Fellow. Noah will be helping me during today's session. So if you all have any thoughts that you would like to share in the chat, we'll be kind of keeping an eye on those. And also just any questions that you have, feel free to unmute yourself and ask during the presentation, or if you want to throw them in the chat, you're also welcome to ask them in the chat box. I don't believe we have other team members today. We may have other folks join, but for now we will get started. And then if folks want to start chiming in, feel free to unmute yourself during the presentation. I do welcome you all to either keep your cameras on or off, however you feel most comfortable. And this session is really an opportunity for us to think about systems thinking in an educational setting. This concept may be new to you or it might be very familiar with you. So this presentation will be more of the kind of the fundamentals of systems thinking and really thinking about how this applies within classroom systems. And we'll go ahead and get started with our agenda today. So let me move to the next slide. So this is our agenda for today, and the goal for today is to really first kind of broadly think about what is systems thinking and how does it apply to equity. So really understanding what these concepts mean and how they apply to education. So from a really broad lens, thinking about what these terms mean to educators. Then examining how this is used in teaching and learning. So as I shared before, the presentation will be really focused around classroom learning, but systems thinking does apply to other educational systems and other educational needs. So thinking about it specifically in teaching and learning, but also thinking about how this fits into our broader lens of education. Next, we will then think about how systems thinking can be used to surface inequities in our educational systems and how this applies. And then my goal is to really kind of share some more practical ways of using systems thinking in your leadership as educators, and how to use systems thinking to support inclusive and equitable learning environments. So these are our agenda goals today. The session we'll kind of talk about each of these elements, and then I also have some opportunity to think about how these apply to you. Some of you may be already teaching, others may be interested in teaching, or others of you may not really necessarily be interested in teaching, but interested in going into educational leadership. So systems thinking can apply to all of these, and it's a really interesting way of seeing how things interact with one another and can be applicable to a lot of the work that we do in education. So excited now to get started. And before we talk about systems thinking, I wanted to first think about the terms equality, equity, and justice, and how these apply to systems thinking. And you may have seen this visual before. It has been adapted to also think about justice and how this relates to equity and equality. But starting with the concept of equality, as you can see in this visual, and think about this visual as students, right? So you have different students that represent different backgrounds, different needs. And for equality, the assumption is that everyone has benefits from the same opportunities, the same support systems, and has the same equal treatment. So that is how we define equality. But as you can see, these students do vary. One of them cannot see over the fence. One of them is taller. So then we have to think about equity and what do these unique students in this kind of metaphor need to ensure that they can that they're supported to be able to see over the fence in the same way and have kind of the same support systems, and that's where we get to equity. That wall is a symbol of systemic barriers. And by removing this wall and turning it into a chain link fence or something that doesn't block these individuals from seeing, it really is part of justice and ensuring that that it's not necessarily just focused around accommodating to needs, but also removing these systemic barriers that have produced these inequities within our system, and really identifying how we could develop ways to remove these systemic barriers. And that's where we really start thinking about systems, right? And how there are systemic barriers that prevent and blocks certain students from being able to have equitable learning environments and receive equitable learning practices. And identifying what those specific systems are is part of how we use systems thinking. So for today's session, we're really focused around equity, and for equity, very kind of just broadly, equity means that every student can develop and to their full potential, and has kind of the right tools and resources to be able to reach their full potential. And in thinking about equity and the ways that it could be supported, you can look at it from a lot of different ways, and we'll talk about some of these, but number one is really interrupting some of these inequitable practices that may exist. Also, for educators and for those who are supporting students, allowing opportunities to examine our own biases that may prevent from equitable teaching practices. Uh, Creating inclusive learning environments, and what does that actually mean, and how can we create inclusive learning environments. Also, working with students to cultivate their own unique interests and their own unique talents in learning, and really engaging them in the learning process. And overall, really supporting the outcome, the learning outcomes of students of all backgrounds and of all needs, and really embracing diversity among students. These are all the kind of the core goals of equitable teaching practices. And when we connect this to systems thinking, we really think about these systemic barriers that may be preventing students from being able to achieve equitable outcomes and equitable learning environments. So wanted to start with that, and I'll let you all think about that a little bit. And now thinking about equity and systems thinking, for those of you who are kind of newer to the concept of systems thinking, I did want to just share just very high level what is systems thinking. And for systems thinking, in broad terms, it's really looking at how systems interact with one another and understanding how these different components within system impact each other. So systems can mean a lot of different things. It could be our human systems, it could be our learning systems, it could be our educational systems, our political systems, our community systems. And systems thinking really recognizes the intersection and interrelationships between these systems and how they influence one another. And systems thinking can become very scientific in looking at specific mechanisms and processes that feed one another. For this presentation, we won't go into that, but I just did want to acknowledge that there are studies and kind of mechanics that really look at how systems kind of create feedback loops and can either negatively or positively influence one another. So if any of you are interested in learning about that, I've been kind of learning a little bit more about it myself. And I think CGU actually has a couple courses on systems thinking, but there's ways of actually mapping out how relationships influence and interact with one another. And that's another really useful way of understanding how systems and relationships interact. And it's particularly a really powerful tool to understand issues and problems that are important, but also very chronic, and that they can't be solved by one simple answer because they're very complex problems. And but as part of that, we also know that they have very unique features that you could identify. So identifying what those features are and then how they all interact and influence one another is really the key goal of systems thinking. And to kind of break this apart even further, I wanted to just really kind of high level kind of give a comparison of what traditional, and sometimes they call it linear thinking, is compared to systems thinking. These are very broad terms, and it's there's a lot more kind of backing behind this, but very broadly, it's looking at For traditional or linear thinking, you're thinking about individual parts in isolation, so not really looking at whole systems, but how one thing is producing a specific outcome or is resulting in a specific behavior. Versus systems thinking, you're really looking at a whole system and how this whole system interacts. Because you're looking at the whole system, you're not specifically focusing on the core content within the system. You're more looking at the processes behind the system and whether those processes are negative or positive, and how they're what relationships they have with one another. Versus with the traditional or linear thinking, you're really more focused on the content that occurs. The way I like to see it, so I'm in the public health field. When you go to a doctor, you can see a general primary care physician that really looks at the whole body and looks at how um, the diagnosis may be being impacted by a variety of different things, versus a specialist only looks at one specific area. But they're both important. Just one is really more focused on the whole system interaction. The other piece to think about is for traditional thinking, you're looking at cause and effect approaches. So, really finding kind of some solutions to symptoms, but not really focused around the underlying problems. Versus for systems thinking, you really are looking at the dynamic factors that occur, the different feedback loops that may be resulting in these causes or results or outcomes. So there's really more kind of big picture thinking and really understanding what these systemic factors are, and that's really the focus when it comes to solving problems. Whereas for traditional thinking, we're kind of thinking a little more technically and finding more direct solutions for symptoms or kind of more cause effect relationships. So that's kind of just a quick overview of systems thinking. For those of you who are new, the biggest takeaway to systems thinking is really kind of thinking really big picture and really understanding how multiple systems interact. So in thinking about that and kind of thinking about your own space, either in teaching and learning and in leadership, I wanted to pose a question and give you all a minute to think about what are some ways or ideas that you have as far as bringing in systems thinking into your classroom or within your own leadership role. I'll pose this question again as I kind of share more information, but I wanted to share this question now in advance and start thinking about how this specifically pertains to you. So I'll give you all a minute to think about that. Feel free to send your comments in the chat, or just jot them down for yourself. And I'll give you all a minute to think about that. right, if we want to come back together, and I was been kind of taking an eye on the chat, and you all have made some really good ideas and suggestions as far as kind of how systems thinking can be used within classroom settings as well as leadership. And you all can read them there. But I did want to highlight something that stood out to me as far as kind of a common piece that or kind of common theme that I'm seeing, and it's really focused around engaging students in kind of this co-creation and kind of connecting them to their own way of seeing the world. And I think that is one of the key elements that occurs with systems thinking is really looking at ways to engage students in a variety of different ways. So I think Aldo had shared through the use of metaphors or workshops that really engage students in the process of dissecting information and really helping, through metaphors. I think that's an excellent way of really helping them connect their own lens of the world and engaging them in the learning process. Giving voice and co-creating, I think, was is also an excellent way that Larissa has added, and really ensuring that student voices are part of their own understanding of learning and understanding of the material. Janita's comment about using exploring oppressive systems and cross-cultural commonalities, and really understanding and engaging students in learning about systems in our world is also very important. We're all part of systems, whether you're the student or the educator. We all kind of fit in within these oppressive systems. So engaging them and understanding that, and really supporting them and being in kind of advocating for themselves and understanding how to dismantle systems is definitely very important. I haven't read through the others, but I think Derek, you had a comment about the more effective. It's more effective to find a comprehensive solution instead of just assign blame on one element. I completely agree. Um, it's not the teacher's fault or the administrator's fault or the parent's fault. I think that's very important, Eric. And actually, or Derek, there's actually a slide that I'll share on just kind of understanding how um, they're in terms of understanding these elements and how they all feed into each other. Both either it's the teacher, the administrator, the parent, how these systems influence one another, and understanding how you can't find a solution or blame on one specific system. It's really kind of looking at the entire system as a whole. So thank you for sharing that. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide, and thank you all for sharing. And just keep in mind this question is going to be asked again. So if you're still kind of thinking about it, feel free to continue to kind of process it as we move along in the slides. The next slide I wanted to talk about is systems thinking habits, and there's a book by it's in the references that I'll include in the slides, and it's by Senge, and he talks about just systems thinking and how it applies to organizational learning and some of the habits that we can think about when it comes to systems thinking. And um, when it in understanding systems thinking, it's really seeking to understand the bigger picture of how issues interplay with one another, identifying causes and effect relationships, testing our assumptions, which are not always correct. Sometimes they're assumptions, sometimes they're biases. So really testing and understanding whether we're making assumptions that are not correct and can be reflected on and corrected. Identifying some of the unintended consequences and why they may be arising, finding specific leverage points within a system for change, and also resisting and making quick conclusions. So sometimes, there's a problem, and I think as Derek shared, we tend to put blame on one system or on one person, when really there's a bigger system of interactions that's occurring that's causing the problem. So really restraining for or resisting from making conclusions or assumptions about specific results. And some of the benefits that I wanted to highlight is understanding that systems thinking can be a really powerful tool to understand equity within culture, within policies, within programs, practices, and learning environments, and also the inequities that are occurring. understanding how these things are all interconnected, supporting our ability to see larger systems, thinking critically and reflecting critically on just why things are the way that they are and why things can be changed. It also helps support collaboration among people that come with multiple perspectives, multiple disciplines, and how we're all working together to foster a common vision or co-create, as one of you mentioned. Co-creation is really important, and when looking at multiple systems and kind of how we intersect, it's important to think about the qualities that different systems bring, as well as the different barriers, and how they could still be fostered to have a shared vision and co-create specific areas of interest. And in thinking about why this is important in education, so systems thinking can be applied to a lot of different things. It's used a lot in healthcare, it's used a lot in social justice, and it's used a lot in education. And the common reason why they're used in all of these is because uh, learning and our educational systems are very complex and very dynamic. So ultimately, for systems thinking, the end goal, when it comes to, especially in the classroom, is really improving student learning outcomes and how can systems thinking be used to improve student learning outcomes. It's also often used to improve efficiency. So if you see that um, uh, like budget, school budgets aren't being used correctly or can be used more efficiently, system thinking can also be a really good tool for that. It's also good to use for understanding specific problems in educational systems, including achievement gaps for specific groups or any other systemic problems that we may be having. For example, when you're monitoring student data, administrators could adjust their budgets to allow for specific instructional material that students may need that they are now kind of connecting to their specific data sources, and also understanding kind of unintended consequences that may happen. So, like if you have limited school funding, it might result in higher student teacher ratios and inadequate supplies for students, and this may result in lower student level achievement, which puts then a strain on teachers to help their students meet their achievements and benchmarks. So there's all these interactions that would occur as a result of one kind of outcome. So it really helps encourage school leaders to coordinate and manage school systems and really look at ways to improve efficiency and also in areas that we have inequity, restructuring specific systems so that we could produce improvements in equity. And I wanted to share this image with you all, and it comes from an article called "Fostering Student Belonging in Secondary Schools Using the Socio-Ecological Framework." And I really like the socio-ecological model because I do think there's an interesting way of seeing how systems interplay with one another. And this model itself, I really liked how it had the student at the core, right? So student and think about student behavior, student learning are influenced by all these different layers of systems, starting with the student themselves and their own areas that they may have of need, that are then surrounded by their support systems, so their teachers, their parents, their peer support group network, that are then surrounded by what they're calling exosystems, or like kind of another layer of systems that look at school policies, different activities that support these students in their development, um, rules, practices that are all kind of surrounding the student, this educator, that are then influenced by our extended systems, looking at our school systems, our neighborhoods, our school boards, family members, and kind of the broader influencers of this educational system. And then you kind of look at all the politics and kind of our social climates and understanding how these are governing any changes in reform for educational systems, as well as legislation that may be impacting systems. So as you can see, there's a lot of different systems that influence student learning outcomes. Some of them are easier to identify and also easier to address, and others are definitely more of our macro systems and looking kind of at our political and social systems and how we all can kind of play a part in these different systems. So I'll let you all think about this one and the article is in the references, so feel free to kind of take a look at it and look at it more deeply. But what I did like about this visual is really seeing how um, our systems interact and also are kind of layered when it comes to looking at students at the core. Another visual that I also found interesting, and this one actually is a little different because we're looking now at the individual level instructor, kind of at not really at the core, but kind of at the center of this model. So you're looking at the instructor and the instructor's ability and capacity to teach inclusively and be aware of opportunities and gaps to engage in reflective practice. And this is all this is influenced by a variety of different systems. So at the structural level, looking at training and evidence-based practices that address achievement gaps. So what training is are these individuals or educators receiving that support them? Also looking at it from a data level, identifying course-based patterns for students in terms of achievements during and after their course. So really looking at it from a data lens. At the institutional level, identifying campus opportunities and gaps across courses, schools, and other domains. And at the student level is really finding ways to support students and understand them from their own experiences. And this could occur um, through through focus groups, through offering students office hours, through survey data, a lot of different ways to understand students' experiences directly. So I wanted to now move and think about why systems thinking is important in education, and kind of now shifting to thinking about how this is also kind of an intersection of race, power, and privilege within our society and within our educational systems. And if you all reflect back to the last visual with the different layers and understanding how our social climate and how students may have different experiences within these systems, how that all influences them in their own student outcomes. So really understanding how this can then be used to identify interventions that address root causes of inequity, and also finding entry points that connect them to specific ways to support them in changing these inequities, and also using it to analyze how systems parts are function together and are also interconnected. So as you all think about that, I wanted to pose the next question. And now that we've kind of reflected on the fact that our educational systems are very complex, our learning environments are very complex, individuals themselves are very complex and function within dynamic systems. What are some ways that you feel systems thinking can support you in creating or delivering effective teaching? And you all have shared a lot of ideas, so if you have others, feel free to chime them in. If not, we'll move on to the next slide. But I'll give you all a minute to think about that. And if you have any thoughts, questions, feel free to send them in the chat. All right, does anyone need another minute? No, we will move on to the next slide. So I'm seeing a chat. Let's see. Yeah, that's a great point, Larissa. So mapping with students the micro, meso, ecosystem around them and bringing them into the classroom. It's a great idea, and it's actually I won't go into detail too much about this piece, but systems thinking is actually a really great tool to also use within teaching. So not only using it as a tool for educators to understand student systems, but also for students to actually use systems thinking to understand kind of how they fit within their systems and using it as an activity to map out like Larissa had mentioned. I think that's a really great tool and a really good suggestion. See Aldo. Yeah, it's a great point, Aldo. I think especially structuring and understanding kind of the understanding the structure of the experience for students that function within multiple systems and including voices of students in feedback is really important. And I think it's definitely that was actually one of the second kind of image that I shared when getting student feedback and getting student voices is really important when it comes to understanding systems. Thank you for your comment. Derek had a comment about training students for modeling examples. We don't want the next generation of politicians, businessmen, and professionals to have closed-minded thinking. I completely agree. I think bringing in systems thinking as early as you can. In other countries, actually, I can't remember which country, but there's certain countries that bring in systems thinking very soon in terms of like just the actual concept into the classroom, um, and really finding ways to develop systems thinking skills at an early age, so you could use it in your own professional life is a great tool and a great resource. So thank you for sharing that, Eric. Derek. I think Jonah. Did I see Noah? Oh, Noah. Noah has replied. So I think we'll thank you all for your comments. I think we'll move on, but it seems like it's getting us all thinking about how we can think about systems thinking in our own lives and in our own practice, as whether you're a student or educator or other settings, how it could be used. So thank you for sharing some comments. Now let's move on to the next slide where so now we're going to kind of shift now into kind of the next section where kind of thinking back to the objectives for this presentation. These next slides, I wanted to share a couple more tangible ways of looking at how we could use systems thinking to develop equitable and inclusive learning environments. And one way, or some ways actually, that we can think about inclusive learning environments is to really try to establish it as early as you can. For those of you who are either already teaching or thinking about teaching, some ways to start establishing inclusive environments early is to first assess ourselves, as individuals. What are our own cultural practices, our own biases that we may have, and how we then kind of build out our classroom culture. So it's kind of doing some a culture check, not only of yourself as an educator, as an individual, but also of your classroom culture and how they may either be positively or negatively affecting students. Our goal as educators is to have inclusive learning environments, but sometimes we may have some ways to improve the inclusivity of our own environments through our leadership within the classroom. So doing a cultural check is one good way of doing that. Also, opportunities for discussion and kind of open dialogue and student voices that represent a variety of different views is another really good way of doing this, and establishing mutual trust and respect, creating community within classrooms will allow for students to be more open and more willing to um, to be part of this discussion and to really feel included within these conversations and within these learning opportunities. It also comes with establishing norms early on. So depending on your classroom age and kind of the population. For this specific discussion, we're thinking about mainly kind of secondary college level students. So establishing norms through your syllabus, through the policies that you have within your classroom, setting up norms very early on in your course as far as how to work collaboratively and how to embrace diversity in cultures within classrooms is very important. And also supporting students in discovering their own cultural identities. For anyone, whether you're a student or kind of a a teacher or kind of a professional in different settings, we're always learning and we're always kind of exploring different forms of identity and beyond cultural identity. There's also a lot of intersectionality when it comes to identities. So allowing for there to be open dialogue and inclusion of these areas really helps support students in their learning and ensure that that we have an inclusive learning environment. And it also comes with embracing diversity, so exposing students to a wide spectrum of identities when it comes to your curricular design, to the material that you use. One of you, I can't remember who it was who shared this in the chat, but really looking at material that not only highlights our non-oppressive systems, but also our oppressive systems, and allowing students to talk about it and to dissect that information. Teaching students from a culturally inclusive perspective, and also just ensuring that we have the proper use of dialogue and behaviors that value differences. Avoiding assumptions of student backgrounds is very important. So that it comes with understanding our own biases. And although we want to embrace diversity, we also don't want to assume, because a student is from a specific background, that they represent a specific opinion or a specific way of seeing the world. So really avoiding any assumptions of students and also acknowledging their intersectionalities when it comes to also looking at gender, ethnicity, social, ethnic, and other forms of background beyond just race. So really looking at the intersectionality that comes with students and encouraging them to also explore that themselves. As educators or leaders, it's also important to think about our own beliefs and our own biases, becoming aware of our unconscious and conscious biases that we may have as it relates to racial or gender equity, and really understanding our own positionality when it comes to circumstances, when it comes to these circumstances. And you know for those who come from different backgrounds and positionalities, we may have unaware biases that either were developed through our own training, through our own upbringing. Even the most well intentioned and great educators may have biases that we may not be aware of. So, really being intentional about understanding our own biases is very important, and it's a really good kind of initial step to ensuring that we are maximizing opportunities to develop inclusive learning environments, and also, for those who do not come from historically marginalized communities, ensuring that we do everything possible to understand those challenges and to really understand the challenges that students face to be able to support them as best as possible. Um, and I think that's all I had to say here. So, welcome any of you to share any thoughts or questions or additional areas that I may be missing. But these are kind of some key takeaways that I wanted to share with all of you. And thinking about systemic barriers and the intersectionality of student identities, um, I wanted to kind of just pose this question of what are some additional ways that may come to mind now that you may have not thought about in supporting inclusive learning environments. I'll share a couple more in the next slides, but I wanted to kind of open up this question of just looking at systemic barriers for students that you may be working with or yourself as a student, and understanding kind of the intersectionality of our identities. What are some ways to support inclusive learning environments? right. Does anyone need additional time? Um, I just saw a comment come in from Larissa focusing on creating safe spaces. I completely agree, Larissa. I think that's really important, and I didn't use safe space in my slides, and I'm glad you added that. I do think it's very important to build safe spaces. Also, we call it community, so really establishing community and safe spaces for people to for students or other individuals to voice their opinions, their backgrounds, their needs is very important when it comes to developing inclusive learning environments. And then Aldo also made a comment about looking at decolonialization and understanding kind of how to also look for systems that may be invisible to us. Excellent point, Aldo, and really identifying some of those systems that may actually be not as apparent, but are one of the primary kind of underlying causes of inequities. So thank you all for sharing that. Yeah. And let's see, Janita's comment about Larissa beating her to the point. Yeah, I completely agree. These are all excellent points. Thank you all. All right. So I just wanted to end with a couple other kind of thoughts to think about and accommodating for diverse needs. So beyond kind of backgrounds and kind of looking at our ethnic, racial, social backgrounds, also looking at diverse needs when it comes to other forms of diversity, including disabilities and learning needs. So really ensuring that we're accommodating to different forms of needs when it comes to learning, understanding the need for multiliteracies and different ways to learn material, including audio, images, graphics, and other forms of, of, of allowing students to absorb and process material is very important. Using captions and transcripts in materials, making technology very accessible to students, ensuring that they have a way to, especially during this period where we're all, for the most part, still in virtual spaces, ensuring that students have equitable ways to use technology to support them in their learning, ensuring that the material is in an ADA format. So as you can see, my slide here is actually in a different font, and this is actually one of the formats that's recommended by ADA, but there's a variety of different ways to ensure that that we're using equitable and inclusive um, material and tools to support students in their learning and engaging students to a variety of different learning styles and considering the impact that your material may have on physical disabilities. So other areas to also keep in mind. Larissa is smiling. um, all right. So, and then the last piece that I wanted to leave you all was is thinking about dynamics and as an educator who's working with a student, really understanding the dynamics that your classroom brings to learning and how dynamics can also influence learning as well when it comes to our learning system. So, how your classroom is set up and how that may emphasize interactions, how moving around may de emphasize the student teacher hierarchy, and how that actually could stimulate more discussion and engagement among students uh, offering a variety of ways to interact with students and offering them opportunities to do group work, paired group, individual work for some students who who have a desire to work independently or with groups, offering a variety of different opportunities for them to engage with the material and with their peers, and also supporting them with different forms of material that they can engage with. So really looking at kind of that dynamics and ensuring that that you develop a very dynamic way of supporting students in their learning. So that's what I wanted to conclude with. So I'll share some last minute thoughts, but I wanted to kind of open up the question that we started with and thinking about what are some ideas or ways that you have taken away from this presentation on using systems thinking for your classroom or within your own leadership role? If you wanted to jot down some ideas for yourself, if you want to share them with us, feel free to. If not, there's kind of some thoughts that you could walk away with for today. So I'll give you all a minute to think about, and then we will conclude. Right. So as you all think about that, and I'm seeing a comment in the chat. Oh, Noah just shared the slides, so you all are welcome to get download those slides. The resources that I mentioned are in the end of those slides, so feel free to refer to those. And I wanted to just conclude with these last thoughts and thinking about equity and kind of the complexity of our educational system. It often does take courage to look at ways to interrupt and transform inequitable systems in place. And that's where really it comes to leadership. And whether you're a student, an educator, an administrator, there's always a leadership role that you could take within changing systems and inequitable learning practices, either through your own practice or by engaging in your school board and different policies and within all these different systems that influence student learning outcomes. There's always an opportunity to promote equity, regardless of how complex it is. The the best tool or kind of outcome of systems thinking is really the way that it's used to support and identifying kind of these leverage points that we could use to support in the development of promoting equity. So really, that's kind of the key takeaway that I'm hoping you all take from this presentation is that although it's complex and although we do function within multiple systems, really looking at the bigger picture helps us in identifying kind of some tangible leverage points to engage and kind of be leaders in changing inequitable practices. As educators, it really comes to understanding our curricular design, ways that we may be grading or assessing students' learning ineffectively, and changing those and changing some practices that may be causing inequity within our own classrooms. It also requires developing awareness and attentiveness to factors that are influenced by systems and have been oppressed by systems. So looking at the issues of race, power, and privilege, and understanding how these oppressive systems have impacted these specific areas and how that has resulted in an equitable learning and student outcomes and how we could play a role in changing that. So I wanted to leave you all with those thoughts and thank you all for joining. I did take a really quick check on time and we only have a couple more minutes. So I wanted to conclude with just taking a quick poll just to get a sense of how this presentation worked out for all of you. Please be as honest as you would like to be and I hopefully it was of use to you. So I'll launch it now and if you could um, please complete that poll. It does help us with just understanding whether this session was useful and also whether you would like to get some more information about this and also your background for our own data needs. Please complete that. I'll give you all a couple minutes. Did it pop up, Noah? I'm not seeing. Okay, actually, I just saw one vote. I'll give you all a minute to complete that. All right. Does anyone need? I'll give everyone one more minute. In case anyone needs another minute, and then I'll share a couple more resources at the end. All right. I think everyone has voted, so I'm going to close the poll now. Does anyone need another minute? All right. I don't think we're all done. So I'm going to end the poll. So thank you all for completing that. And I just wanted to conclude with a couple resources. So number one, if any of you do not know this, we are very open to meeting with all of you. We do have an appointment system, so feel free to make an appointment The appointments can be used for a variety of different purposes. It can be used to just discuss any questions that you have with us, including myself and Noah and others on our team. So feel free to check us out and make an appointment to just have some time to chat about areas that you would like to talk about. We could also use the appointment to review material that you've produced. So if you have a teaching philosophy statement or a diversity statement that you would like some feedback on, it's also a great way to meet with us. So feel free to reach out to us and make an appointment so we can continue this discussion and answer any questions that you have. Um, the poll we already did. I also wanted to share that we do have a LinkedIn page. So if you're not on our LinkedIn and use LinkedIn, please consider joining our pedagogy community. It's a really great way to network with one another and also to learn about more opportunities happening within either PFF or other areas and trainings that are being offered in our network. A lot of different ways to connect with us. Noah did share the slides already in the chat box, but they will be also on our website and emailed. So if you would like to access them, you can access them there as well as through our chat box. And we have a lot of different social platforms. So once you receive those slides, if you want to kind of look around in our different platforms, then feel free to network and connect with us in any of these platforms. And these are some of the resources that I wanted to share. So there's 2 books that I like on systems thinking. One is by Peter Senge, and then there's another one by Capra and Luisi. They're both very good. There's others that are more focused around education. So just if you do a quick search, you'll see a couple books that might be of interest to you, and a lot of different online resources as well that you could check out. These are some of the articles that I refer to, but there's many others. And with that, I will conclude. We have about 2 minutes. So happy to invite you all to just share any other thoughts, any questions, what your lunch plans are, anything. And thank you all for joining. If not, you're welcome to get 2 minutes back in your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted now to say personally, thank you for your listening.
Thanks, Clarissa. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I'm glad you were able to join us.